Hey, you accursed! Before we start the show today, I have some goddamned exciting news. We four, your ever-loving political panel, are doing Curse of Politics live at Maple Leaf Gardens on November 17th, holding the show right there at Center Ice. I think it's called the Mattamy Center now, and there's a big grocery store in the building too, but that's not the point. The same storied venue that once hosted historic performances by Elvis, the Beatles, Muhammad Ali, and Elton John now gets Herle, Reid, Teneycke, and Leichnitz. This is a Rubicon strategy event with lots of pre and post networking opportunities and cocktails, bringing together Canada's top business leaders and political insiders for a live Curse taping. Again, that's Curse of Politics, live at Maple Leaf Gardens on November 17th. Reach out to Rubicon if you're interested in a high visibility brand sponsorship, and I can't wait to see you all there. Greetings, you joyously miserable accursed. It's David Herle here with your ever-loving political panel, Jordan Leichnitz, Kory Teneycke, and Scott Reid. Panel, fucking all joy this morning, despite the winter wonderland out there. The Habs won and are looking good. And
That's
my
true.
Riders are going to Winnipeg for the 112th Grey Cup. I retract anything negative I've ever said about the quarterbacking skills of Trevor Harris, and I retract all the terrible things I said about Coach Corey Mason the last 2.5 minutes of that game. They may have been profane. Anyway, here's our show this week. Like the Royal House of Habsburg, the topics are big today and they're intermingled. Make or break budget votes last week, and this, coinciding with conservative defections, resignations, alleged strong-arm tactics, and general unrest with Pierre Poilievre's leadership. What surprises will the next 5 days bring? Our cursed clipping is right on point. It's Althea Raj's piece in the Toronto Star about the soapiest of soap opera weeks Ottawa's seen in some time, and then after all that sturm and drang, the stabilizing, centering voice of Gordon Pinsent and our Hey Yous. So, Jordan, you're the only person I really care about today for some reason. So how are you?
I'm so good. How are you doing?
I am generally pretty good. Although I am worried about being up here. I'm snowed in. I've got no winter tires. I'm nervous.
So you're just gonna toboggan back into Ottawa when you need to.
You know, a couple of the hills up here are not to grade. So it's a
That is true.
tricky prop, tricky proposition. Um, Kory, how are you doing?
Good. I don't know. Just spent yesterday cooking, hanging out, doing stuff in the snow. I don't know. It was good.
You're
Good.
cooking?
What'd you
I
cook?
was cooking. You would like this, Scott. I was doing pub food. I made a steak and Guinness stew and a Scotch egg, which is a lot more difficult than
Scotch
it
egg.
sounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, you like
I
Wrap
love
the
the
soft
Scotch
sausage
egg.
around
That's
that
good.
egg.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then
We'll
then
be
you
over at
bread it, and then
6.
you deep fry it. Anyway, poor Nicole, she was like the taste test dummy, having to taste various of these until I got it nailed. But anyway, yeah, it was fun.
God, Kory is extremely nattily dressed. He's a good cook. He
All right.
goes out to amazing vacations and things like that. How are you standing up? Like what is your what's going on in your life?
Well, I shoveled the driveway and I don't have anything more to add. Actually, that's that in a nutshell is the contrast in glamour between Corey's lifestyle and mine. Uh, Instead of cooking, I just laid face down and ate snow. Um, that's it. My life is unglamorous.
Are your kids at least happy about the snow? You got at least one young enough for that.
Even the 16-year-old was out yesterday just pounding the piss out of the 12-year-old with snowballs. So yeah, no, they liked it.
Just joy across the board, right?
Yeah, no, it's like, oh, this is a brand new way to incorporate the elements into our nonstop carnival of fraternal violence.
Yeah. All right. So politics. So it is so
Speaking of pounding the piss out of other people.
Speaking of pounding the piss out of people, Jesus Christ, we'll get to that. That is so attractive to talk about. But I don't know if any of you remember but there was a budget last week, right? And in some quarters, this budget was generational and transformational. So we should talk about it because it happened in the last week of our segment here. All right, you information craving hurly-burlyites. Who wants to learn more about AI nodes and stacks? Rhetorical question. It's my pod and I make the rules. Thus, I give you more AI demystification from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, who are rightly proud of their new sovereign AI factory in Rimouski, Quebec. So, nodes. Love that sentence. 2 little words, but an infinite amount of computational power. Because an AI node is akin to a brain neuron. It works to process data. And when one node is linked to other nodes, they collectively solve the most complex problems. But while a human brain's approximately 86 billion neurons are limited by physical constraints, AI nodes can scale infinitely and process data at superhuman speeds. TELUS is using the most advanced GPUs from NVIDIA for their nodes, capable of performing trillions of calculations per second. I don't mind telling you that my personal set of 86 billion neurons, if it's still that, can hardly comprehend that. Moving on to the accurately named AI stack and what makes TELUS's so special. Accurate because it's basically layer upon layer of tech, data center, computer hardware, storage, security, networking, orchestration, platform, applications, all of these complex functions coming together in a manageable system to enable efficient and scalable AI implementation. But remember, it's not just an AI factory, it's a sovereign AI factory by design, which is true for every layer of the stack. So all components of the factory, all those layers I just talked about, are under Canadian control, empowering businesses to be AI creators here at home without foreign dependence. Next week, more AI demystification and a deeper dive into TELUS's unique relationship with NVIDIA. So, Jordan, why don't you start off? Tell us about the much anticipated budget. What is your sense of how it plays politically?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a budget, but I'm not sure it plays politically, and I think that's part of the problem. Um, Perhaps unsurprisingly, I do think it ended up being really a bit of the worst of all worlds for Carney in terms of having some very large deficits in it that would be displeasing to people on the right side of the spectrum. And then on the flip side of that coin, also having really significant cuts and no real sort of social policy vision at all that would help with the left side of the spectrum. So I think it's a budget that Carney likes. And it's a budget, I think, in a lot of ways that's sort of floating on trust, both trust for Carney himself and his own economic credentials, that this is the right path, and that there's a bet there that Canadians will follow along with that because they continue to have largely confidence in the Prime Minister for this sort of thing. And then it's also built on trust that they're going to be able to leverage the private sector investment that's really the underpinning of the offer that they're making in the budget. And I would say, that's a pretty big bet. And that's a bet that historically has been pretty difficult to make good on in Canada. So we will have to see if Carney's able to buck the trend on that with some of these measures. But it's both difficult to leverage that private investment. Investors in Canada are sort of notoriously very conservative on these things and reluctant to invest their money back. It's also very long. It's a really, really long play. All of this stuff was really long. So we're talking about things where people aren't going to really see direct benefits in their lives for sort of 5 to 10 years. And so that's a problem because for regular people, they will wonder what is in here for me. And no, talking about a tax cut that was given several months ago that nobody asked for is actually not an adequate response to that. And then the second thing, and I think this is maybe a little bit more esoteric, but for a lot of people in the country, their buy-in around general economic growth as a path to prosperity, I think, is pretty weak right now because they don't really feel like they are specifically getting their fair share of that growth. There is no guarantee that they will do better when the Canadian economy does better. And there was really nothing in this budget that addressed that sense. And so I think it had some pretty significant weaknesses. And I mean, we can drill down into some of the
If I
more,
could just say,
yeah,
Jordan, to that point, because I think it's a really strong point, really important point. They may believe that they can't do better unless the economy does better, but they don't axiomatically believe that they will do better if the economy does better, right?
yeah,
And
that's
so
right. And
that's the missing link, right?
and there's like, they're right. There's facts, there's a lot of facts to back that up. And
Yeah.
inequality is a big part of that. We are in a moment right now where those who are doing well are doing very well and the rest of the country is not. And so I think the budget did not address that. It also touched on some symbolic stuff that was really bad. So for example, scrapping the luxury tax, I cannot, I guffawed when I got to that, right? So like on the one hand, they were missing
I was
four
thinking about, I
measures in
had been
affordable
thinking about
housing.
buying a yacht, and then I
Yeah.
decided
Well, there
against
you
buying
go.
a yacht because of the taxes. It was
Yeah.
outrageous how much the taxes were on that yacht. But now
Now
I
you're good.
Wait
I assume
till
the
you see
measure
what
was
they are in
written
a
for
PJ.
Kory. It's like,
Yeah,
I want to check the registrations and see if Kory
Kory's gonna
met
land his
with
jet on top of the
finance.
condo
Well,
there.
You
He's
know
just
that
doing it, guys. He's just doing it to help Bombardier out. So I
Well,
don't know what the problem is. But
you
let me
know
finish.
this. You know the saying. You know the saying. If it flies, floats, or fucks, it's cheaper to rent. So anyway.
Well, you would know, Kory.
Ah!
But listen.
Ah!
So, aside from having budget measures that are pleasing to Bombardier headquarters and Kory Teneycke, they were missing really big chunks of their housing affordability push, right? So in terms of going back to those trade-offs about who is going to be the winner and the loser and who is this for, I think they really missed the mark on that, in addition to the substantive stuff, but also the communications frame of it and some of the symbolic pieces in there were completely off. And this is the sort of thing that you can imagine in perhaps a regular PMO and a regular finance minister's office. There would be people who would be attentive to that and who would see that and say, this is perhaps a problem. That the man who doesn't do his own grocery shopping is overseeing a budget wherein we are loosening these things and not attending to these other things. But this is neither a regular finance minister's office nor a regular PMO. So I can presume those conversations didn't happen. In short, I'm not a big fan. I think you did a really great deep dive, by the way, on the Herle Burley on this that goes into a lot of what those trade-offs are. But I think that, for most people, they're going to look at the general directionality of this budget. They're going to say, what did I get out of it? Are we going the right way? And I'm not sure the answer is going to be uniformly yes on this. So I think for me, it was a miss.
Yeah. Hey, Scott, let's deconstruct it just a little bit, because there was so much news that overshadowed the content of the budget. But assuming that hadn't happened and they got a clean launch, what do you think they wanted the story to be?
That's not entirely clear, because again,
that's why I'm asking. Yeah,
it gets muddled by the communications approach and I mean, this almost feels trite now. It's been a week since a budget or whatever, and it's been said so often by so many people, it feels kind of boring. But the mismatch of expectations is really a challenge. They got to figure that out. So when you're going to say it's generational, this is I hate hinge moment. I wish somebody would just strike that off the tablets. Okay, hinge moment. I know the Prime Minister loves to say it, but it sort of sounds like something that everyone now in the government feels they're obligated to say, because the Prime Minister prefers this saying. So everyone's like, it's a hinge moment. I had to choose whether or not to get up this morning and put on a red cap or blue cap. It was a hinge moment. Future of humanity hinged on the decision. I don't know that I heard them say this. I assume, based on the content of the budget, that what they really wanted the message to be was that this is a growth budget, that this is to protect and to provoke growth for the future. Because if you look, to me, the hidden story of the budget, and it's not that hidden, but it's that when you look at the economic projections, and they included economic projections for the United States, which I thought was interesting. So their economic projections for Canada, 1% growth, 1.0 for as far as the eye can see. For the United States, 1.0.
It's assuming CUSMA remains in place, by the way.
Pardon me?
That's assuming
right.
CUSMA remains in place.
That's right. So, look, I think in a weird way, I've thought enough about the budget now that I'm now under the countervail of it. Like, I think I'm now zagging. My zig was all the predictable stuff. It doesn't seem that political. It's not very street level. It was poorly preconditioned. It was a mismatch, all that kind of stuff. But I think in a weird way, it's an oddly courageous budget, depending on your definition of courage, because there's two gigantic bets in it. One is that they can afford to be relatively apolitical in this budget document. And the second bet is one that Jordan spoke about, which is that they are betting, the prime minister, I really feel this is the prime minister's budget, that the prime minister is betting that these measures will, perhaps not immediately, but over a period of time, they will incentivize and provoke growth, and they will provoke, particularly, they will provoke business investment. And I really worry about that. I really wonder whether that bet will pay off. It may take 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10 years before we know whether that bet pays off, or before conditions conspire to permit that bet to pay off. They're assuming, whether it's the big pockets of money for housing or the $115 billion worth of productivity and competitiveness measures, they are assuming that businesses will say, well, if I can get a 100% capital cost allowance deduction in 1 year, in this first year, that I will invest in machinery and people. And I'm not certain they will. I'm not certain that that business is going to look out there. When you hear Goldie Hyder's response, which was, this was a step in the right direction, I feel like saying, well, what the fuck is it you want then? You want the government to literally de-risk everything. I want you, we're talking about betting earlier. Well, I want you to place a $1,000 bet that the Habs are going to win the Stanley Cup. I'm going to give you the $1,000 up front. And I'm going to tell you that if you win, you get the money. And if you don't have to return the money. That is the situation, it seems to me, the business community is saying would be acceptable. But by the way, don't inflate the deficit, which is to say, could you cut everything that isn't directly for me as a cigar chomping devourer of wealth sitting in a boardroom somewhere?
Tomorrow is November 11th. Tomorrow we remember the men and women who went off to fight for Canada in foreign wars, some of whom came back with terrible physical and mental injuries, and many of whom did not come back at all. Ask only that we remember. And we do remember, with immense gratitude. Our sponsor, CN, proudly remembers how its railroaders served at home and overseas. During the Great War, the Corps of Canadian Railway troops, drawn from Canadian railway companies, were responsible for building light rail tracks near the Western Front in France and Belgium from 1917 onwards. And here at home, rail companies that would eventually form Canadian National Railway moved troops across Canada to the seaports from which they embarked. During World War II, the Canadian war effort moved mostly on the railways. Their tracks and trains carried 90% of the war's cargo, triple the pre-war volume. CN's resources, its trains, its yards, its shops, its staff, were placed at the disposal of the government and Allied war effort. New locomotives and rolling stock were ordered. CN moved everything from soldiers to tanks to armored vehicles to ammunition. By 1944, Canada had built 40,000 miles of track. Rail had become the single largest wartime industry, employing 150,000 people. And once again, of course, Canadian railroaders donned uniforms and went off to war. They were, in fact, among the first to be placed on active service. They gave and they sacrificed. You will read a singular phrase this week, lest we forget. We will not forget what those people did. We will never forget.
Last thing I would say is this, and it may be a small point. Even if I 100% believe that those measures would flow through, the $115 billion worth of competitiveness and tax productivity measures, I wish to God that somebody had stood up and said, let's not call it the productivity super deduction. It sounds so silly. It sounds so ridiculous. It sounds like a tax deduction, a regular, thin, bespectacled tax deduction, went to a science experiment and a spider dropped on its hand, bit it, and suddenly this unsuspecting capital cost allowance mushroomed into a super heroic productivity deduction. It is ridiculous sounding. I find it impossible to believe every time I hear it. How could this dry, central banker-ish budget that's all about structure, how could it possibly then say, but let's call it the productivity super deduction? That sounds cool. We'll put a cape on this tax measure. It's just, anyway, so I'll stop there.
All right. Kory, your
Hard to
turn.
beat that. God
Yeah, I
damn
know,
it,
exactly.
Scott. That's
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
very invokes a lot of images. Look, I don't know. I think a lot of I kind of agree with Scott. A lot of this is being said, but I'll say some of it again anyway. Like I really don't understand the buildup to this budget, like what they were thinking. And I was just been pondering it hanging out this weekend, and I wonder if some of it isn't just the personalities of people involved. Like, Champagne strikes me as an excitable individual who is a bit of his own hype man and a bit of a hype man for the government, and whether that just got away from them, like the talk about how big and how pivotal and how transformational this budget is going to be. Like I don't know. It seemed, I get some of the things they're trying to do, but it didn't have the feel of a Paul Martin budget slaying the deficit. Like you guys have done a pivotal budget like that. Like it's a big thing. And I don't know. I just didn't see the thing match up with the hype. I think you guys are correct on where the politics probably are on this. Like it's, Jordan's right. It's not tactile enough for regular people. But on the investment side, like kind of I heard a couple things, and maybe I'm melding in his Carney's speech in Toronto a little bit here too. But like we've got a couple of problems. One, Canada hasn't been as attractive for investment for a long period of time, and that's part of the problem. And they're trying to address that through a number of different measures. But the other part is trade instability with the United States. And I don't see anything on the horizon that makes that look like that's going to go away anytime soon. So, I wonder if this budget actually hits the mark on that front. Like, not to say that we don't have to become more competitive in terms of investment. I think we do. But, if it's a problem that requires alignment on two things, one being more competitive and two, ending the trade problems with the United States, and you're never going to have two happen, then are you actually treating the right ailment here? Are there things that we need to be looking at doing that would be different in the context of a trading relationship with the United States? It's not going to resolve itself anytime soon. At least as we've talked about many times, I don't think that's going to happen. So I don't know if they've set themselves up, once again, calm-wise, for a good outcome. Because if we don't have any resolution on the trading side of things, then I think people are going to circle back to this budget and ask some tough questions as to whether or not these were the right choices.
Can I jump in? Can I add one thing? Because
You sure can, Scott.
I have because just what Kory says I think is interesting, because and it goes back to the point that I wanted to make about the almost deliberately apolitical nature of the budget. It loudly declares that it is not a budget that tries to connect with my Aunt Doris with a series of street level measures and supports. And it also loudly declares that it is not a budget that is intended to be a lens as to how we boost or reignite talks with the United States on trade. It almost explicitly says that's not what this is. And I wonder if politically part of the calculation here is that the Prime Minister wanted a structural budget. He might disagree with our analysis, but I wonder if in part this was almost a planned thought, in the sense of, look, this is my one shot. If I believe that there's a need for something that's medium term in its measures, right, that is structurally, it's a central banker's budget. It's a structural budget that's intended to nudge the economy in certain places. My one shot to do that is now, because next year I have to plan for something altogether different. Sometime in the next 12 months, Trump's probably going to run a CUSMA. It's going to blow up not just 2 or 3 sectors, auto, steel, aluminum. It's going to blow up a whole series of sectors. There's going to be a need for a massive direct spend on people to support people and industries. I'm going to have to put in massive relief projects and programs. And that's going to be my street level, trade dictated to budget. This is a structural budget to try to reorient ourselves. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't, maybe you believe in it, maybe you don't. But I wonder if his plan is, I have the political room to do this now. I may never get it again. And next year, Trump is going to blow up our economy, and I'm going to be forced to spend a bunch of money just helping Aunt Doris and her nephews stay in shoe leather as the United States blows us up.
So, for careful listeners in this space, most but not all has been revealed. I've teed it up these last few weeks. The federal government's climate competitiveness strategy, part of Budget 2025, is finally here. In the words of our sponsor, the Canadian Climate Institute, it takes clear steps to strengthen Canada's climate competitiveness in a world moving swiftly toward decarbonization as the greatest economic opportunity of this century. But they are also first steps, and more concrete details will matter about how and how swiftly these policy actions are implemented. Remember the context. In the face of Trump trade uncertainty, Canada has pledged to double our non-US exports in the next decade. Big goal, relatively short timeline. Increasing trade with partners in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, all of them making massive investments in clean energy, is key. So the budget proposes actions and delivery timelines to bolster our climate competitiveness on many of the core policies the Climate Institute has been talking about in this space. Industrial carbon pricing, stronger methane regulations, sustainable investment guidelines, and tax credits for expanding clean electricity. For their part, the Institute looks forward to working closely with the feds to quickly turn words into results, because policy certainty is ultimately what attracts new investment to Canadian firms. Never more needed than now. I'll end with the words of their president, Rick Smith. Swift implementation of climate competitiveness priorities will define how Canada succeeds or fails. More on all of this at climateinstitute.ca.
I have the same thought as Scott.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is that it's a long time between this budget and the next budget. And one of the tests
or maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be next spring.
Yeah, we don't know, right? I suppose, yeah. But let's assume it's a year. And I think one of the tests that I was looking at in this budget, is like who are we asking to kind of shoulder the sacrifices of the economic uncertainty through this period, the way this budget is structured. And it's clear that Bay Street got a whole lot in this budget, even though they are not happy and they would really like their broad-based corporate tax cut. They didn't get that, but they got a whole lot of other stuff. And I think the challenge is that it's, Scott, as you pointed out, like the human side, the worker, the side of the workers, the side of like the people who are impacted in a different way by the tariff war really didn't get very much in this. And it's a long time to wait for any kind of structural assistance for those folks. And so I think that was a huge gap. And I actually don't know that there wouldn't have been a reason that they couldn't have done both in this budget. Like you don't have to choose necessarily. If you're Carney, you could choose to do your structural elements, but also provide some of that assistance. Because the problem is, if the scenario unrolls as you describe, in terms of continuing to be pummeled by Trump, by the time you bring those relief measures in, like it's too late, right? Like, you need those in place largely before we get to that situation. And we know that is probably coming. So this would have been, I think,
for a reform of EI, or are you looking for a special
Absolutely.
program?
Both.
Right.
Well, I think you need to see both. Like there is a definite need for sectoral stuff beyond what was in this budget, but it's also, this would have been a really sensible moment to go at some of the structural gaps that we know very well are there within EI on a system that we know is likely going to be really needed in the next year. So instead, we're stuck with a situation where you've got a system that, a lot of people are paying into and less than half are going to qualify for. And so
it is an interesting question, though, if you think that is coming and then those measures will be inevitable, as to whether you do them in anticipation or whether you do them in the face of the actual crisis. I'm not trying to make
it. I want to go back to that. What was actually in the budget? And I want to just say to you folks, I have a theory about this because I've been curious, and maybe maybe everybody's gone on the same journey that Scott has gone on this week. But in the early part of the week, when people were still talking about the substance of the budget as opposed to floor crossers and stuff, it was widely considered to have not met the definition of being a generational budget. It was widely considered to have been overhyped and not to have been as big a thing. And I was kind of curious about that because, frankly, the deficits seemed massive and deliberate out into the future. It wasn't like they were apologizing for them or talking about how they were going to ratchet them down. It was like proudly, no, we're going to be running deficits into the future, and that's how we're investing in things. It's a massive shift from consumption to investment. If you talk about the what's going to have to happen to close down that operations line and what's going to so it is a conceptual shift and seemingly kind of the end of social policy for the near to medium term. So there's a lot of huge things in the budget. I think the reason people thought it was small was because it underdelivered on cuts, ironically. It wasn't either the cuts weren't explicit enough. I think that's what media was looking for. They were looking for the here's who's getting fired and here's what programs are being shut down as evidence of the sternness of this approach. And it wasn't there. And so I think people thought it was a little bit of a damper squib than it actually was. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I think there was a lot of commentary going into the budget around what was going to happen. And look, and on that front, I don't think they did enough. Like, frankly, if you look at other sectors that saw big ramp ups during the pandemic, those businesses and other governments have pared that back and sort of rationalized it to something that or normalized it to something that makes sense. That never happened with the federal government, and it's very unaffordable, and it disproportionately helps one city in the country. I don't think it's something that's spread out more evenly. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think it went far enough there, and I think that was part of the expectation in terms of transformational, et cetera, that people were looking for. It didn't deliver on. Although there's something else that happened, and this maybe speaks a little bit to Jordan's point around EI changes, et cetera. Unemployment went down by 0.2 points. Like it surprised the hell out of me in seeing those numbers. But we actually had a growth in employment in manufacturing, right? Like I've been of the theory that we're going to see job insecurity and concerns around employment levels starting to push or crowd out cost of living concerns by the public, because you kind of get that sense out there. But and then we see a jobs report that comes in and that shows that we created a bunch of jobs, including in manufacturing. So I don't know, it's puzzling to me. But in the context of that, I'm not sure that the data says we've got like a great crisis there, Jordan, that needs to be addressed.
Well, I mean,
maybe we will, but
yeah,
we don't
like there's going to
today.
be noise in those month-over-month numbers, right? But I think you can look broadly and you can see that in some demographic areas we're looking at 10-year highs of unemployment right now. So I think there's a strong potential for it to still continue to get worse before it gets better. But the argument around fixing EI is because you kind of are going to have two scenarios, right? If we do end up with more serious unemployment, you can either have an EI system that captures most people who will be affected by that, or you can create one-off programs to support them, to close that gap.
But don't you think most of the people who are most affected, if you're looking at where unemployment are, probably don't qualify? Like it's younger people trying to enter the workforce that are getting the shit kicked out of them.
Well, it's part of the problem with the way the
well, you do need a cushion though for auto workers and steel workers and
sure
forestry workers for sure.
Anyway, it's a long-standing problem, but this, there's an argument that this could have been a good moment to fix it so the system's more fit for purpose as we get into rougher waters.
Hurley Burleyites, November is Financial Literacy Month. So let's talk about something many Canadians struggle with: financial confidence. Whether you're new to the workforce, new to budgeting, or even new to the country, feeling in control of your money isn't always a given. According to recent research from our sponsor, Interact, 61% of newcomers to Canada arrive feeling financially confident. But after settling in, that number drops to 31% as they face unfamiliar systems, fraud risks, and uncertainty. And it's not just newcomers. Interact data shows that a majority of Canadians say that they face barriers that hinder their sense of financial control. They want more knowledge, more tools, and more reassurance in how they manage their money. That's why Interact is focused on empowering Canadians by helping them build lasting financial confidence. They're partnering with organizations like Women's Shelter Canada, Conscious Economics, and Access Employment to host financial confidence summits, provide mentorship, and deliver programs focused on budgeting, fraud awareness, and digital literacy. They're also supporting tools like Credit Canada's Butterfly budgeting app, designed to help newcomers navigate Canadian financial life with clarity and control. Because financial confidence isn't just about having money, it's about understanding how to use it, trusting the systems behind it, and knowing support is there when you need it. That's a role Interact is proud to play every day, helping Canadians stay in control, supporting small businesses, and keeping our financial future secure right here at home. All right, so Scott, let's lead us off on this part of it, which is this is not a budget in which they've got people's backs, as we're just talking. It's not a budget that says to people, hunker down, bad times, but we're going to be there to support you. It doesn't say anything like that. And it's not a budget that, as Bullwinkle the moose used to, hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat, and pulls out some cure for the economy. Nothing like that. They are left with selling a plan.
Yes.
That is what they are left with. They are left with saying the other people just want to get government out of the way, and they say that will solve everything. But we have a plan.
I think that's right. The challenge on that front, I saw the Prime Minister's speech. I was at the Canadian
Prime Minister
Club
always likes to say plan beats no plan. And we know from 100 years of research that Canadians do like the idea of their governments seeming to have a plan.
But you need to tell them it's a plan. And I was going to say, like, I was at the Prime Minister's address at the Canadian Club, his post-budget speech, and it was exactly what you would expect. It was thoughtful. It was well composed. It hit all the elements of the budget and summarized them. And it sold it in the way that he wants to sell it, which is to try to excite people about the fact that one deduction is stacked on top of another, which creates a cumulative effect that can't be resisted, and the industry is going to have to be tugged along, and so on and so forth. So whatever. I mean, that's the story he wants to tell. So fine. But if they've made the choice, right, that they are going to have a conceptual structural budget that is intended to try to shift, knowing that it will take not just time, but years perhaps for the judgment of whether these measures are effective or not. If that's what they want, then if it's a plan, they need to say the word plan over and over and over again. My problem is they start their story in the middle. They start with productivity super deduction and how it stacks on top of another deduction. And they don't say, listen, this is a plan. This is a plan to protect people on the one hand, but it's also a plan to try to gird us for growth and to try to establish the ingredients for growth so that we don't have to worry about whether or not we're vulnerable constantly to whether or not the United States allows us to get $1.80 or $1.90 per transaction. And I don't think they've done enough of that. And then the final thing I would say, which you and Kory and everybody else I know with half a brain cell has said, fucking advertise, man. Change the law. Take a half day of bad news.
That wasn't in there, was it?
Didn't see it, but
I didn't see
there.
that measure in there. I did
there.
not see that measure in there. Jesus fucking Christ.
By the way, one other thing you said earlier, which I want to jump back on, you said there wasn't enough cut, or the cuts were not explicit enough. They were not. But that's true. But they didn't show us the bone saw and the bloody stump, but it's there. I know from talking with them, they haven't just said, here's what the figures are. They've actually done the work. So they know where those cuts are going to come. And so we will see those things rolled out. They have an idea of which department and which agency is going to have to cut what and where. So that's going to be interesting to see how that gets metered out in a way that doesn't dominate headlines, because you don't want it just to be about that. So We'll see how that lingering tail of the budget is managed, because you don't want a bunch of deputy ministers who are like, fuck man, I've got nothing left to lose, I'm just going to go out there and trash this budget anonymously and talk about the darling program or activity that gets cut and try to get stakeholder groups all riled up.
You were talking about
That-
you guys.
that's the
He
worst
was
of all
talking about
worlds.
starting the thing in the middle. One of the things I'm interested in is why they seem to want to happy talk us about the economy. Leaving
I don't
aside
get it.
Kory's jobs numbers for a second, we're in the shit, right? And that's kind of why he was elected, because we're in the shit. And I think the bigger shit we're in, the more the argument for Carney is. And so I don't know why they want to happy talk the current situation. And whether it's his speech before the budget or the pre-budget speech, I don't get the sense that he's laying the groundwork for the kind of real trouble that Canada's in.
Well, I think I know what, or I'll posit why I think he's talking about it that way, because I don't think voters are his audience on this or many other communications that come out of this government. I think he's talking to the investment community. I think he's talking to the banking community. I think he's trying to sell a message of something's changed in Canada. I think it's a very narrow audience that is interested in the message that I heard coming out of Carney, both in his speech and in the budget. But it's to those people. It's the people who can write the big checks and take some money off the sidelines and put it into the economy. And I don't think he wants to shit talk the economy while trying to make that sales pitch. But in terms of the electoral politics, I think you're absolutely right, David. But I think this is the weird sort of contradiction around Carney. Born under the luckiest star in the entire fucking Milky Way, as evidenced by the floor crosser, et cetera, which we're going to get to, I assume. But he can seemingly disregard the normal rules of politics and political marketing and largely get away with it time and again. And whether it's assisted by sort of lucky shit that happens separate from the budget or whatever, but he I think I get what he's trying to do there, but it runs counter to what hacks like the four of us would recommend in terms of marketing something politically.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of the problem is that, and we can go back to his speech to the university students where this was also a problem, is that there's not like agreement on the problem that he's trying to solve here. Is he solving for the tariff war? Is he solving for the affordability crisis that people are feeling? And to what degree is this a crisis that's going to require sacrifice? But then I'm going to be cagey about what the sacrifice is. And so all of the setup in that, I think the contradictions and the lack of clarity in that continued into the budget. And to go to the question of cuts, like this is what I mean about it being the worst of both worlds for the government, because you have people arguing, on one side that these cuts were not deep enough in terms of to galvanize, the idea that we're making those significant sacrifices. Well, they actually are quite deep and they know what they are, but they don't want to say it. So now the worst thing is that they're going to say it going into the future. So the bad news is going to come out about those cuts uncushioned by the goodies that you might have ordinarily in a budget. So that as a choice is also not without implications as well for them. And I think that you would have better luck with that if there was more of a coherent story about what they are solving for here in a way that's actually grounded in people's lives. I think that you're quite right that the audience for this is very much the investment community. But the time that the public will have patience for that, I think, is short, because while people right now still seem to be really reserving judgment on Carney and kind of giving him the benefit of the doubt as he's trying to solve for these things in the trade war, as he's trying to solve for some of these structural things, that is not going to continue indefinitely. And it's going to get much harder as time goes on, particularly if there's not a lot of progress with the United States. So I think to circle back on what are some of the reasons why you would want a budget like this to be a little bit more well-rounded? It's to bring people along with you, right? It's to show that you're interested in immediate outcomes for people and not just the machinery of government that maybe is about the kind of how, but what is it that you're actually producing out of this that's going to impact people's lives? And they really didn't get kind of a coherent answer on what they're solving for and what that's going to mean for people in a way that I think is helpful to them.
The following message is brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Not all nicotine products carry the same risk. Smoke-free alternatives like heated tobacco, vaping products, and nicotine pouches don't burn tobacco or produce smoke. While not risk-free, evidence shows they have the potential to be significantly less harmful than cigarettes. Yet, Canadian regulations restrict access and limit communication about these alternatives, keeping adult smokers in the dark. Sweden has accepted this science, embraced smoking harm reduction, and driven smoking rates below 6%. Canada has the tools to do the same, but it requires political will. It's time to align regulation with science, expand access to smoke-free products, and empower Canadians to make informed choices. The evidence is clear. The opportunity is real. Canada can be smoke-free. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.
All right. Let's move on to the news that happened immediately after and significantly overshadowed. And let's see if we can add something new to this, because it's been massively discussed. So let me just lead off with a segment from Althea Raj in the Toronto Star. By the way, thank God, Althea Raj, she's a great writer and she's so well connected. She's always got stuff. But anyway, she says, amongst other things, and by the way, we're jumping into the middle of this story about floor crossers. If you listen to the show, I presume you know all about the blah, blah, what happened. The mood on the Conservative bench is grim. Stories of strong-arm tactics by Poilievre's team continue to be shared by other MPs. Poilievre on Wednesday forgot to move the Conservatives' budget amendment. And on Friday, the party voted to extend the Liberals a lifeline by voting with the government against a Bloc Québécois motion that was being treated as a confidence vote. If Poilievre wanted an election, he could have had it on Friday. Now all eyes are on Monday, November 17th, when the main budget goes to a vote. Will more Conservatives defect? The Liberals hope so, as they still count heads. Généreux last week abstained on the 2 confidence votes. Even if he does so again, it leaves the Grits 2 votes shy or in need of 3 more abstentions. So, folks, what is, and I won't start with Kory, I'll leave him to think about this for a second. What is happening inside the Conservative caucus right now? Is this thing over? Is it they got 1 or 2 people that were unhappy left? Is it a boiling cauldron in which there's almost 20 more people that are thinking about leaving? What has precipitated this and brought it to a head? Scott, lead us off.
Well, I'm going to make the assumption it's over insofar as the immediate crisis as to whether there will be additional defections appears to be over. Like it appeared, and I don't know that's a permanent state, but I'm going to assume, because if it's something else, then this thing goes haywire and unpredictable, and then it gets organic and interesting. I'm going to assume that whatever they did, carrot, stick, cannon, threats, more stick, put the thing together and kept it from expanding further. So, and I think that has, like, so even if you take that assumption, it has a couple of legacies. One, it was clear that something bigger was brewing. Like, there's a what if about this week. What if it had unfolded the way the Liberals had actually hoped? Because D'Entremont was not supposed to go the day of the budget. D'Entremont presumably was supposed to go maybe with a couple of others the day after the budget. It was going to be packaged. I think D'Entremont, for some reason, decided to talk to the Conservatives and blew himself up and then forced emergency measures. And then that created a bunch of pressure on the others that were waffling, like Généreux and so on and so forth. So how might it have unfolded if none of that had happened, if it had been played out clean? It's an interesting what if. We'll never know the answer. But one thing that happens is now there's a culture of unease and mistrust. So on the one hand, if you're a hardcore conservative in that caucus and you're like fucking Généreux and D'Entremont and a couple of those others, you're looking at a couple of the others who released those hostage videos. Hi, happy to be here, staying right here. Everything's great. I'm holding up a newspaper. Then you're looking at those people and you're going, I can't trust any of these fucking people from Quebec in my caucus. They're not true believers in Poilievre. That's for fucking sure. Maybe they stayed, but just by the skin of their teeth. So now you are looking askance at some of your colleagues. Then there's the other group of people who are saying, I watched what happened to Matt Genereux. And I won't speculate here as to what happened to Matt Genereux, but something fucking gruesome happened to Matt Genereux. I'd rather quit politics than continue on in this caucus. I'm not going to issue one but two statements. One to say I'm leaving, the second to say, no one made me leave. Everything's great. I got time for different choices. Why am I talking about my family? I don't know why I'm talking about my family. It's none of your business. You stay away from me and talking about my family. Like the whole thing was just fucking shaky. So people are going to be sitting around going, you know what? I'm not perfect. Does the leader's office have an oppo file on me?
Well, you got just stop right there.
So I'm living in fear.
But that is got to be the end of it. I mean, I can't believe, not the end of the issue, the end of Poilievre. I can't believe that if the caucus comes to the conclusion that there is a file on them in the leader's office, that they all have, like, that they're living under that cloud of fear, that they will tolerate that. It's the most absurd thing. Jordan,
I mean, there's a file on all of them, right? That is, I think, to be taken for granted. But I think
isn't that twisted?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think it's pretty standard practice for all parties to keep tabs on what not just the opposition is up to, but what their own folks are up to. Now, the question of what happens to that information, is that used in sort of like a regular process of vetting and verifying to make sure there's no surprises, or is that used to threaten and browbeat people? That is probably a pretty significant difference between management styles, I would argue. And I think what Scott is saying about the divisions now and the mistrust within the Conservative caucus is actually the key thing going forward. To like skip to the end, I actually don't think this will have really any impact on the leadership vote for Poilievre in January. I think he's still fine. Yeah. But what I do think it does is that it absolutely drives a wedge between the red Tories and the people in that caucus who were just sort of along for the ride and tolerating Poilievre, and those true believers and the people who are really, pretty wacky on this stuff within that caucus. And so now you have that sense of mistrust, but also of policing each other, right? And it is incredibly corrosive, right? Because you know that if you're in that group, you are going to be watched. You're going to be watched by your colleagues. And if it is true what we're reading, in terms of what the interactions have been like with Poilievre's team and d'Entremont and others, like this is really negative stuff. And it's also a confirmation of some of the absolute worst traits that Poilievre has. And so we can now truly, truly put to bed the idea that anything was learned from this campaign, because what he's exhibiting here is exactly the stripe of behavior that led to him having such a hard electoral ceiling. And he's doing it now to his own people. And that happens in moments of weakness, right? So I think that it is something that actually will continue. It will go forward. It will continue to have really negative effects for their caucus, but primarily because their guns are aimed at each other. And at the end of the day, what you might actually see is a real hardening of the people who are more in that populist pro-Poilievre camp, and a real unifying of that group around him as an outcome from this, which probably is pretty detrimental to the party over the long run. So, and I think the response to this is likely going to make all of that much, much worse.
Maybe this is a strategy. Maybe he has a file on all of us. Maybe his strategy for the campaign is to threaten all voters to vote for him. We're all going to get an email saying vote Conservative or else. I know about what you did in second year university.
Yeah.
Okay. And she's a librarian now, and we can fuck you up with that. Okay. So just vote Conservative, shut up, keep your head down. It could work.
I'd also just say, the bar for somebody who is more of a red Tory to hop over to the Liberals now is so much lower because Carney is a red Tory. So, it's very attractive in a way that it wouldn't have necessarily been in the past. If you're in that camp, it's a much softer landing. So, I'm sure that dynamic is not finished there. There's still, that pull is still going to be there. And I think that the destabilization is something we're going to continue to see.
Well, the disenchanted people, Kory, what do they want? Do they want to be liberals, or do they want to have a leader who can defeat liberals?
I think it's the latter. I think it's the latter. And I look, but there's an element of, well, if you don't appreciate me, well, then I'll find somebody who does. Like these things are both, political and they're personal in my experience. Like it's a combination of the two. And you got to get a positive on each one of those questions before you have somebody crosses the floor. But the one thing that I've seen push more people over the edge than anything else is going into their office with a baseball bat and start smashing furniture and throwing the phone across the room and making threats. Like talk about how to take somebody who is probably going and may go anyway and send a message to anyone else who's thinking about it to let them know that that you're a little bit unhinged about this stuff. Like I don't know. I think one of the things that Poilievre's leadership team's been trying to do post-election, and I think it's a smart thing, is to try to soften the relations with caucus. Like not all of these fatwas on travel and needing to get sign-offs by the campaign manager, et cetera, before you're allowed to utter the name of a journalist, let alone speak to one. Like all of that stuff, I think was taken to its absolute, outer extremity of what you can get away with without caucus totally revolting on you. And I think they loosened the screws on that a bit. And I think caucus is, generally speaking, being happier as a result. And I think it's good. I think that they've had a lack of other people out communicating for them. Too much Poilievre, as we've talked about before. Needs to be more of an Avengers movie. It's not a Superman movie. To do that, you got to allow these other people to have conversations and maybe travel and do things to go out and market the party. But the reaction to these potential floor crossings is, I think, a snapback to the pre-election approach to this stuff. And I worry about, having a consistent narrative, just like we've talked about in so many other things. Like you can't sell the message that, hey, we're going to allow MPs to play a bigger role and communicate more and all of that kind of stuff, and then go back to the, smashing shit with your baseball bat approach to caucus management. I think it's, maybe it prevented, one other, Jean from crossing the floor, and he's just retiring now as a result of, threats and intimidation. Maybe that's what, pushed that. But I'd be more worried about, what that does to others in caucus who are unhappy, and the message that you're sending to them, and whether you're demonstrating whether you've learned anything from the last election campaign or not. I don't know. I think too much is read into this stuff in one way, and then in another way, I think how you respond to it, can be important.
Yeah, I'm largely disinterested in that vote in January, Jordan, because I know the guy can pack that room. But in the Herle betting house, the odds that he gets chonged at some point just went up over the course of the past week by a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
The one thing I would add, just as a last note, they had to get through Wednesday. So it's easy for me to sit here and Monday morning quarterback and say, well, they got to be careful how much how much vinegar they use compared to honey. Well, on the other hand, they had to get through Wednesday. And I think maybe things were more precarious than we understand looking back on it. I think it was a shaky situation. He didn't forget to table that motion because he was in a straight headspace, I think things were pretty fucking squirrely.
Yeah, but I don't think they improved their situation.
I agree with that. But at that moment, their situation was survive. Because if they'd had 3 defections, I think that would have caused a run on the Poilievre bank. Right.
All right. Mr. Pinsent, let's wrap it up.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Okay. Who's got a Hey You they want to do this morning?
Well, I got one related to this, so
all right, do it.
I'll maybe go first. I wanted to do a Hey You to our sometimes election co-podcaster Mickey, and it's Jurek, right? That's correct pronunciation. Derich, right?
Yep.
Because she got the big scoop on this. She's the one who got Chris D'Entremont to actually spill the tea that he was thinking of leaving the party. So anyway, I saw that. I didn't, as is often the case when big news happens, a lot of people don't share who actually had the scoop and broke the big story, but it's our friend and sometimes colleague Mickey who did it. So anyway, big shout out to her. That way to go. It's not every day you get a scoop like that. So here's to you.
Excellent, for sure.
Good one.
Jordan?
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up on what I was saying earlier on. So my hey you is going out to the Prime Minister because let's be real, this is your budget. And look, you are still a couple votes short, and it may be that you don't need the New Democrats in the end. We'll see. But nonetheless, that doesn't change the fact that there's still a really big imbalance in what you've proposed here. And we talked a lot about the ways in which this budget didn't necessarily meet the moment in terms of support for working people, be that sectoral support or support in terms of addressing some of those problems, dealing with EI. And I should add, by the way, that this is like a pretty small component of having some kind of a social offer in your policy. I'm not even talking about social program spending. I'm talking about the idea that you should throw big on the people doing the work, not just on the businesses and the tax breaks and the investments. That there is work to be done here to make sure that working people know that the government is, number one, going to be there to support them in these truly exceptional moments, and number two, to make sure that we actually do have a workforce that's up and skilled up and capable of meeting the moment and the transformations that you're proposing here, even if we buy into your whole framework here. I'm coming along with you, but you're missing a piece. And at a time when we're really seeing so much insecurity, you got half of Canadian households across all income levels now living paycheck to paycheck. That is a lot of people who are feeling scared about the future. And one thing that you can offer as the federal government is working with the provinces to show a path that, we have a plan to make sure that you are going to be able to follow the new jobs that are coming, that these jobs are coming soon, that you're going to get support as you move and transition between roles if that is what's necessary. And then we're not going to leave you alone in this insecurity. None of that messaging really came through in the budget. And there's a huge risk that you're going to end up with a scenario where people feel like they're the ones left holding the bag in this tariff war. And that's not good for your government. And that's not good for Canadians. So that's my hey you this week.
Ready? Scott?
I'm going to stick with a recent pattern that I've been on for the third week in a row. I'm going to make my hey you about the notwithstanding clause. So my hey you goes out to former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He and I are tight, as everyone knows, super close, and I want to give a big tip of the hat, because that was a guy who was present when the charter was repatriated. That's a guy who was present when the merit of including Section 33 in the Constitution was discussed and the trade-offs were made and the context was literally set. And he made the point this past week of coming out publicly and saying, I don't get what's with all these premiers thinking that it's just we should be treated casually. That is not what we had in mind when we brought this thing into being. We were very conscious of the fact that this could have explosive implications. It should be used narrowly and rarely, and that's not what's happening, and it's wrong, and it's out of step with what the so-called framers had in mind. So it's a big shout out to Jean Chrétien. Thank God somebody on the national stage is saying this is fucked.
Can I say something about Chrétien? I heard his interview that he did with Catherine Cullen, I believe, at the museum in Shawinigan for, I don't know what, for the Chrétien legacy. Fuck, I hope I'm not sharp when I'm his age. Like, yeah, he was funny. He was on point. Like, I don't know. Anyway, on a bad morning, I don't think I'm that on the ball.
It is not so bad to be 92 and still be good at me. I could win all day, every day. Now,
I disagree on all the other shit. I disagree on all the other shit you said, Scott. But I do wish I do think that he's pretty impressive to be so sharp and able to do interviews like that.
I know, and I admire David also.
Well.
For that or for other things
for persevering at his advanced condition.
Because yeah, exactly. But also Mr. Chrétien may not have known, but I did know, along with a lot of other people who were watching in 1982, what a massive hole the notwithstanding clause was in the charter right from the beginning, and people can talk about how they expected it to be used or whatever, but it was
It was certainly raised at the time.
Decision to proceed with it, as opposed to fight without it.
It was the devil's bargain.
So, my hey you goes out to Canada's veterans. I'm not wearing a poppy because I don't have one at the cottage, but it does not escape me that tomorrow is Remembrance Day. And something I think about a lot more these days than I normally do is the notion of ordinary citizens standing up and going to a foreign land to fight for a concept as ephemeral as democracy and liberty and freedom. And, these days, it's time to worry about those things again. And it puts a very sharp point on the people that once the greatest generation who fought for those things. And so I remember all of you, think of all of you on Remembrance Day, and let's live up to your legacy. It's my hey you.
You're here.
Thank you all for being here today. And thank all of you, Kirst, who listened to the show or watched the show today, and tune back in next week. My God, who knows what there'll be to talk about? Who knows what kind of beatings will have occurred in Ottawa over the course of the next week that we can talk about. We'll see you then. In the meantime, thanks to all the sponsors. Thank you, Kirst, for listening, and we'll see you next week.